Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Maulana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa ajma'een. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Ustad Abu Ayyub, and I welcome you back for another episode of Our History. In today's episode, we're going to be looking at the coming into power of Kanuni Sultan Suleyman, or better known in the West as Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, and the succession of the Ottoman sultans. We're going to be taking a little bit of a look into how Ottoman sultans came into power and the criteria for them coming into power. So join me today. Let's go. On September 30th, 1520, the 26-year-old Kanuni Sultan Suleyman, or Suleiman the Lawgiver, comes to power as the heir of Yavuz Sultan Selim. Now, Sultan Suleiman was the legitimate son of Yavuz Selim, and because of this, he is the undisputed Sultan of the Ottomans. Now, the Ottomans had been in rule now for approximately 300 years, beginning as a small tribal confederation led by the likes of Ertugrul Ghazi, and then under the leadership of Osman Ghazi, becoming a growing power in the region. Now, 300 years later, Sultan Suleiman is at the helm of this great state. But how does it come to be such? And how did the Ottomans choose their leaders? So how did the Ottomans choose their leaders? Well, for the first generations, it was rather easy and simple. Generally, you would have the father and you would have the father's sons. And it was normally the strongest or the most able among those sons who would come to power. However, as time went onwards, there would be some difficulty in choosing the right ruler for the Ottomans. And this all comes to fore during the early 1400s when Sultan Bayezid I is captured by Amir Timur after the Battle of Ankara in 1402. Now, Bayezid comes under the captivity of the Timurids. And while he's in captivity, his sons, those who were not captured, end up fighting one another for control of the state. In time, you would have 5 brothers fighting against one another in a devastating war, a civil war that would last for almost a decade. Once the dust settles, only one brother survives, laying claim to the throne of the Ottomans. And this surviving sultan is the grandfather of Sultan Muhammad al-Fatih. And this would change many things for the Ottomans in terms of how a ruler comes to power for approximately 150 years. Sultan Muhammad Chalabi, or better known as Muhammad I, comes to power after the devastating civil war. Now, this civil war pitted Ottoman against Ottoman. The state was bankrupt, and the enemies of the Ottomans had seized the opportunity to retake lands that the Ottomans had under their control. It was in this situation, and with the coming of Sultan Muhammad al-Fatih, some 2 generations later, that a change needed to be done. Sultan Muhammad al-Fatih issues a new ruling based upon the Shari ruling of Qatl al-Siyasa, or Nidam al-Alam. Both of these I'll discuss in just a moment, but this was a game changer for the Ottomans. And in the West, Orientalists and other Western academics would use this and call it fratricide, when Ottoman sultans would come to power and seize power by killing off or murdering their brothers. Now, in order to prevent civil war and ensure political stability, Sultan Muhammad al-Fatih needed to enact a law, and this law would prevent future instability from occurring. This law was based upon the Islamic and Shari principles of Maslaha al-Mursala, or for the good of the people and the good of society. Under the ruling of qatala siyasa, or political killing, Sultan Muhammad al-Fatih now issues this law which allows for a ruler, a sultan, to get rid of political rivals, most of them being his own brothers or half-brothers, by having them killed. Now, although this might seem very, very bloody and very ruthless, there was a principle that they were following. They needed to protect the society. Sultan Muhammad al-Fatih grew up with stories from his own grandfather, who fought against 5 of his brothers in this devastating civil war. And after learning of these stories and learning and hearing about the horrors of the civil war, Sultan Muhammad al-Fatih wanted to make sure this would not happen in the future. And without any better means of transferring power. Because keep in mind, the Ottomans are not like the Arabs. The Arabs, the Umayyads, the Abbasids had a system in place that was already culturally acceptable, whereby the death of a ruler meant that his son or other sons would take power. And once a person took power, his brothers would be potential heirs. Unfortunately for the Ottomans, however, this was not the case, because culturally they took from the system of the steppes, the great steppes where the Mongols and the Huns were from. And in that culture, it was more common for a brother, most likely the strongest of the brothers, to come to power and then eliminate all rivals. The law is now formalized. Sultan Muhammad al-Fatih famously says, when a sultan inherits, then he is permitted to kill his brothers for the sake of the betterment of the community, or nidam al-alam. This was very, very important. Now, you have to keep in mind, if you had brothers who many of them would be half brothers and they would be contenders to the throne, because the Ottomans had no system of hierarchy whereby the eldest brother would take charge, it was really up to the individual brothers, whoever, for example, was closest to the capital, or whoever had the support of the military or the janissaries. These are the ones who would quickly assume power. Meanwhile, you would also have other brothers who would vie for power and who would also see themselves as being equally capable of leading the state. And what ends up happening among the Ottomans so commonly is civil war. So in order to finish and end the possibility of civil war, Sultan Muhammad al-Fatih enacts this law. And through this law, under the Shari principle of qatala siyasa, and we can also say using the usuli principles of sadadariya, or cutting off something before it becomes a fitna or before it becomes a sin, Sultan Muhammad al-Fatih allows the Sultan to order the execution of his brothers if they are, 1, guilty of preparing for rebellion or planning for a rebellion, 2, that they are guilty of actually raising a rebellion against the state, which would be rebellion in the eyes of any law, including our own modern laws, and 3, if there's the possibility of them. And this is where the usuli principle of sadadariya comes into place. There are many examples in history where empires had multiple claimants to the throne, leading to protracted and prolonged wars. Other times, empires would be divided among those princes. However, for the Ottomans, they viewed it as one sultan, one nation. This was very important. They also saw that the death of one person was better than the death of thousands. With this in mind, Sultan Muhammad al-Fatih puts this into law, and the laws of qatala siyasa, or nidam al-alam, come into effect for approximately 150 years, ending around the year 1603 with the coming into power of Sultan Ahmed I. Many times when we learn about Ottoman history, however, the way it makes it sound, or at least the Orientalists and the academics make it sound, is as if this system of fratricide or qatala siyasa continued on and on for centuries and centuries. However, this is not the case. So even though qatl al-siyasa or fratricide secures the unity of the state, one of the negative effects of qatl al-siyasa was the fact that the Ottoman family began to shrink. As you killed off possible heirs without the guarantee of the survival of the current sultan, we had a smaller and smaller pool of possible claimants to the throne. So eventually, in 1603, Qatl as-Siyasa is abandoned by the Ottomans, and they then take into consideration a new rule for succession, and this was through Akbariya and Arshadiya, or where the eldest takes charge or takes the throne, as well as the most mature of those heirs. In the case of Sultan Suleiman, going back to him, he comes into power as the sole heir to the Ottoman throne, unchallenged. And his reign will be one of magnificence, it will be one of great victories, and it will be the apogee of the Ottomans. Join me next time when we take a much more in-depth look into the life of Kanuni Sultan Suleyman. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.